ladies, and welcome. This is Marchant Johnson, and I'm so excited that you're here for this very important exclusive training. I have a really wonderful guest expert who is joining us, and that is the lovely Meredith Miller. Welcome, Meredith.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm happy to be here.
So thrilled and excited about having you here. And before we dive into this really important topic, I just want to give a little tiny bit of a formal introduction. So Meredith Miller is a coach, author, and speaker, helping people to heal after relationships with psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, and other manipulative characters. Her mission is to bridge the gap between trauma and purpose. She teaches the mindsets, tools, and actions to help others recover after narcissistic abuse. And I think we're going to be talking about some keys to recognize Mr. Wrong through his narcissistic behaviors. The reason I think this is so important, Meredith, is I always say one of the keys to being with Mr. Right, which is one of the goals that the women here would like to have in their lives, is to avoid the Mr. Wrongs. So our intention here is going to help them to avoid the Mr. Wrongs, right?
Yes.
To recognize, avoid, and prevent the abuse that can happen from these Mr. Wrongs. And I'm really excited about sharing Meredith's wisdom because she just has such a depth of knowledge on this topic, and I think it's so important and so valuable. And Meredith is also one of my former clients, and so I had the privilege of working with her privately in my one-on-one coaching program. It was such a joy and such a wonderful experience to work with her, and I really admire who you are, Meredith, as a person, and the growth that I saw in our time together and the growth that I'm seeing in your work. So thrilled to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so let's just jump right in here. First of all, I would love for you to start with a little bit more of a personal level by sharing a little bit about how you came to do this work in the world and develop this area of expertise.
So my whole life was basically a story of narcissistic abuse. Pretty much all of my boyfriends, and then even I had friends, bosses, coworkers, business partners, neighbors. These narcissistic characters just kept showing up in my life because I came from a family where the legacy of abuse was passed down transgenerationally. And that primed me, it programmed my nervous system to recognize abuse as love and home. So it was normal that I got myself into these relationships as an adult as well. And I finally started to get an idea of that in late 2014. And I figured I should just go to Peru, drink a lot of ayahuasca, and figure out what in me is attracting these people in my life, because I needed to stop that. So I went there, I met a bunch more narcissistic characters in that whole circle, really kind of cracked the code on what was going on, and came back. And that's when I really got started doing this work with this focus in narcissistic abuse. I'd had training in holistic healing, and I'd been doing that for over a decade, but I hadn't really found that niche yet until I discovered the narcissistic abuse.
That leads to another question that I want to ask you. So Meredith, you were talking about how you recognized there was a pattern of narcissistic people and narcissistic behavior in your life. And so what was it that finally caught your attention where you could see, wow, this is something that's happening to me, not just once, it's not an isolated incident, but this is an ongoing pattern. What finally got your attention?
It was a process. I think that's the nature of denial. First someone mentioned the word narcissist to me, I got it, and then I buried it, went back into denial for 6 months. Someone else mentioned the word narcissist. Again, I buried that. And about 6 months later, I had what I would call a frying pan to the head lesson, where it's just so bad, it breaks through your denial, and suddenly you can see it in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the sirens going in the background right now, right? Warning, 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 warning. We'll take advantage of the sound that we have going on there. Warning, warning, warning. So I want to ask you this question, and then we'll delve into some of these signs and how you can recognize some of these patterns and behaviors to help the ladies. So we hear this word narcissist a lot now. It's kind of a buzzword, and it's kind of like an umbrella term, I think. I mean, I want you to define for us narcissist, because I think there's a little bit of fuzziness around it. Does it include, the psychopaths, the sociopaths, narcissists? I mean, I know they all kind of have their unique flavors, but is it kind of an umbrella term? Tell us what it actually means for those people that hear the term but may not really be tuned into it like you are.
It really is the key word that everyone's using now online. Technically, scientifically, if you look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, they call it the DSM, they group those personalities into one group. It's called the cluster B personality disorders. And so they all have similarities, but they all have their own archetype, like you said. And I use the word narcissist because that's the word that helps people find the information that they need. I do caution people not to worry about making a diagnosis. Most of us aren't qualified to do that, but there are very specific patterns of behavior to watch out for. It doesn't matter if the person's technically a narcissist, a psychopath, a sociopath, whatever. The point is they're doing these patterns of behavior, and that's the red flag. That's where we need to take a step back and say, this is not okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. And also the point that we don't have to be trained to know how to diagnose in order to identify and recognize some of these behaviors. So with that having been said, can you share with us some things to look out for, some signs, some tools, some insights into how we might recognize these kind of behaviors, and specifically how women might be able to recognize these behaviors in men that they might be meeting or dating, because that's who our audience is.
So when we talk about narcissistic abuse, there's a very particular abuse cycle. And that cycle has two phases. We call it the sweet meme cycle or the love bombing devaluation cycle. So what that means is you meet this person and they're usually very charming and charismatic and attentive, and they want to know about you. I think often we have this misconception that a narcissist only talks about themselves, but there are certain kinds that do sort of data mining when they meet you. They seem very interested in you because they are extracting information that they will later use against you. They will figure out what your likes are, what you want, your hopes and dreams for the future, what your fears and insecurities are, and they're storing all of that in this bank. And then they're going to use that information to manipulate you. So when you first meet this person, you just start dating this guy, he's going to be blowing up your phone usually. Lots of texts or calls. He's dominating your time and your energy. It's a form of control. Now the danger is if, say your last guy was unavailable, he was never around, right? And then you meet this guy and you're thinking, oh my God, I met my Prince Charming, he's into me, he's giving me all this time, look how generous he is. And that's really dangerous because, as we were talking before, this is like that flattery versus compliments, right? They're two very different things. And the narcissistic person will flatter you a lot. They will usually say a lot of things about you, about your physicality or attractiveness, maybe even your mind or how talented you are. Or, you're the amazing person, the most amazing person I ever met. You're my soulmate. You know this person for like a week or two. Maybe they're telling you they love you in the first week or two. Maybe they're trying to move in the first couple months. This kind of intensity is what you'll usually notice at the beginning. So much of that. And it's really hard to distinguish what is flattery and what is an actual compliment, especially if you're used to this kind of behavior, where flattery is like this very superficial, empty, hollow sort of praise that a person is using to get you to transfer your approval seeking and validation seeking to them. So it sounds great at first, and if you lean into that, what happens is now you're depending on them for validation and approval. And then one day they take it all away. And that could be the day that maybe they met another person that they want to start to do the same cycle with, or maybe you set a boundary, or maybe you called out a manipulative behavior, something that wasn't okay for you. You set a standard. You said, this isn't all right for me. And so immediately at that point, they flip to the devaluation. That's when they start to put you down. So there are both overt and covert forms of this. The overt is very obvious. It's aggressive, it's direct, it's to your face. They will verbally abuse you. They will straight up tell you you're worthless, you're not good enough, you're crazy. The covert side is much more dangerous because it's so hidden. And their devaluation usually looks a lot more like very subtle put downs, these indirect things that they just keep saying these things and you're like, something just doesn't feel right. Like on the surface, it kind of sounded like a compliment, but it was a backhanded compliment. There was something that put you down in the same sentence. Or they're using what we call triangulation, where they're talking about another person and they'll idealize the other person. Oh, so-and-so, so amazing. And they're idealizing something that you have the same quality, for example, but they never build you up about that quality. They never compliment you on that, but they're comparing you to this person in a very subtle, indirect way. Or they're devaluing another person. They're putting a person down. They're shaming them for a quality or something that you have or you are. And then you call them out on it, and they always use plausible deniability. No, that's not what I meant. You just misinterpreted it. And that's when they start the game of gaslighting. So part of that devaluation involves the gaslighting. The gaslighting will happen from the beginning. Usually we just don't notice. But by the time it gets to devaluation, that's when you're calling things out. You're saying this isn't okay. Maybe they're straight up flirting with someone in front of you and you bring it up and they're saying, you're jealous. That's not happening. You're just too insecure. You're just too sensitive. And they start to flip it around on you. So that's actually another key thing that you'll notice with narcissists. We call it the DARVO reaction. DARVO is an acronym. It stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So what that means is you say this isn't okay. They deny that they did anything wrong. Then they attack you. You're too sensitive. You made me do it, something like that. And then they reverse the victim and offender, meaning they make themselves the victim and now you're the abuser. So it gets very confusing, and we call this crazy making because it will literally drive you insane.
Wow, that's so interesting. I love that acronym because that is such a powerful way to recognize some of this behavior. So just to use a tangible example, Meredith, to make this really accessible for people. So this might be a man cheats. And in fact, I had a client once, we'll use a real life example. I had a client once who was dating this man who obviously had some narcissistic personality traits in him. And she was doing his laundry because he was like in between jobs, staying in a motel. She was doing his laundry and doing all these things, helping him out financially during what she thought was a brief transition. In the meantime, he wasn't even really that nice to her and was kind of calling her names and all kinds of crazy things. Well, one night after spending the whole afternoon, evening doing all of this laundry for him, she takes it over to the motel where he's staying to deliver it to him because she thinks he doesn't have any clean clothes. The door is slightly ajar, just barely, like not locked, but just slightly ajar. So she knocks, he doesn't answer. She kind of pushes it open to kind of just say, hello, are you in there? He's in bed with this other woman.
Ugh.
After she's been doing all this laundry. Well, so of course she immediately leaves, doesn't want to get into it at that point. And then he's calling her up afterwards, yelling at her, saying, this is your fault. You don't have sex with me enough. You don't give me enough affection. You're not there for me, blah, 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 blah. And she's like saying to me, am I crazy? Was it my fault? Does that sound like a tangible example that makes this kind of accessible, this DARVO idea?
100%. The very simple word is blame shift. So DARVO is like this complicated acronym, but we call it a blame shift as well. And that's where they flip it back to you because they're incapable of accepting self-responsibility. That's their MO. They never accept self-responsibility. And being with a person like that, whether it's someone you're dating, a boyfriend, a significant other, or even a friend or anyone else in your life, that is a relationship of inevitable harm. Because if they can't own it and they can't own their behavior, you are always going to be taking on the responsibility of that.
A relationship of inevitable harm, meaning if you stay in the relationship, it's going to do you harm. Is that what
Yes.
you mean by that
That's
term?
a term from Sandra Brown. She is wonderful. She did these studies on women who've been victims of psychopaths. And she says it is a relationship of inevitable harm.
Mm. Wow, that's so profound, and that's so important. So I want to ask you about another tangible example that you and I spoke about just briefly before we started recording, which is this this special that I saw on YouTube. It was originally aired on television in Australia, and I'll try to put the link underneath this video too for the ladies so they can actually watch it if they'd like to. But Meredith, this was showing real life people and sharing accounts of people that had gone online looking for love. Some after, you know, long-term relationships or marriages a little later in life. Some of them had a little bit more in terms of resources because of their age and station in life. And some of them had been very lonely and really, really seeking and wanting companionship. And so they went online, and I won't share all of the individual details, but bottom line is they had met these people that, from my understanding in hearing their accounts, had definitely narcissistic behavior patterns going on. So these people were doing exactly what you're talking about, you know, love bombing, flattering, saying how amazing they were. These are even before they've even met, right? Because this is an online thing. Sending all kinds of pictures, maybe even sending, you know, like love notes or gifts, that sort of thing. Well, then things started to flip, and these people, you know, started having crises in their lives, and they started asking for little bits of money here or a little help there. And these people were sending what ultimately amounted to thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, you know, through Western Union and through portals like that, to these people that ended up being, you know, someone over in Africa who was nothing more than just an internet fraudster. And the point that was really interesting to me, and this is something that I want to have you speak to a little bit, is that they said, what people don't realize is that any of us at a given time in our lives, maybe we're really lonely, maybe we've just had a significant loss in our lives, and so we're vulnerable, we're really susceptible maybe to someone's flattery or to someone's attention. They're saying even really smart, intelligent people, because these people that were telling their stories appeared to be smart, intelligent people that had a lot on the ball. It didn't seem like they'd be people who'd be easily deceived, but they were saying even these kind of people, even those of us that think this could never happen to us, in the right set of circumstances, it can happen. And that's something I'd like for you to speak to a little bit, if you would.
That's so true. There have been so many of these cases. Another famous one is the Tinder swindler. If you Google that, you'll see VG is the media source that did this whole story on him. He's still at large. They haven't caught him, but he swindled millions of euros out of European women. And the same exact story you said, starts out amazing, there's all this stuff, and then they're painting this lavish lifestyle, so you think everything's okay with them. Then they run into that crisis, they use the pity ploy. Now you're taking out loans even to send them money, and then they're disappearing and using that money to swindle the next one and the next one. And, you know, like you said, anyone can be a victim of this, especially if you've been through that loss, you've been through that loneliness. Like when you're lonely, don't date. It's like going to the grocery store when you're hungry. You're going to buy all the wrong stuff. You're going to end up gaining weight. You know, don't date when you're lonely, because that is going to attract someone like this. Predators like that can smell that, like a shark smells blood a mile away. So don't put yourself in the market. If you're feeling lonely, get a pet, work on yourself, you know, spend quality time with your friends, find new hobbies, start learning new things, invest in your self-care, and don't put yourself out there yet if you've gone through a major loss as well, because that also leaves you very vulnerable. And this really could happen to anybody who's unaware of these signs. And I think it's so important that everyone learns to look for this, because they are so prevalent in the world. Especially, you know, if you ladies are doing online dating, be very careful, because I would say the vast majority of people on those sites have some kind of personality disorder. It's just the perfect way for them to find prey. There's this great series on Netflix, and there's also a podcast. It's called Dirty John. It's a real story about a psychopath or sociopath who's from California in his 50s, and how he swindled this smart, successful woman who was, I think, about 55 years old. And the exact thing at the very end of the series, they show him online, all the people he's talking to, he's just looking for the first one to take the bait, and then he's on them. And you just got to be really, really careful. You know, I think some dating coaches, not you, but some other dating coaches recommend get off the apps. Like as soon as you start talking to someone, within like 5 exchanges, exchange a phone number and start meeting. Ladies, that is not what I recommend. I recommend you use that app until you feel safe enough to give that person your phone number, because of course you could block them afterward if you notice something ain't right, but that just saves you from all that hassle. Because if you find a true predator, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep getting other phone numbers. They're going to keep calling you. You're going to have to change your number. That could be a huge hassle. So be very careful, and certainly don't meet someone if you don't get a good vibe from them. And these people will come on so strong. What you'll notice is if you don't respond immediately to their text or their call, that's when they really start blowing up your phone. Where are you? What are you doing? And it's like 10 messages. You know, you're at work, you're doing something, and you look at your phone and it's blown up. That's not a good sign. That's a sign of a controlling person. That's not a person you want to give your phone number to. And if you already did, that's a good time to think about blocking that person, because that's not safe.
Yeah, you hit on a couple of really key things that I just want to put the explanation point on. And one is that I believe that as women, we have, you know, divine intuition, and sometimes it's called feminine intuition, sometimes it's called your inner guide, sometimes it's called your gut feeling if you want to just be a little more raw. But I find that most women, if they're really tuned into that, if they haven't suppressed it so long that they can no longer tune into it, most women have a pretty good inner guide as to what's right for them. And if something feels off, online, offline, whatever, pay attention to that, even if you can't identify why that's happening, because that can be a very real sign that something really is off, even if you don't fully understand the dynamics of what's causing that. The other thing is that I want to put an accent on is, yes, these people that suddenly start acting like they should have #1 high priority status in your life. You haven't even met this person, and they're strangers, and they're like all of a sudden being all demanding or getting nasty if you're not giving them your undivided attention. That is absolutely a sign of a controlling behavior pattern, which is another sign of narcissistic abuse, because a lot of these people that are narcissists can start out really nice, and as long as you're doing everything the way they want you to, they're super nice. Boy, but if you step out of that pattern of what they think should be happening, they can get really, really, really ugly.
Exactly. And I just want to elaborate a little bit on that. That's the more overt style, right? That gets ugly really soon. Be very cautious too of the more covert style, which will come across more as victim. So you didn't answer your phone, you're working, you were doing something, and they're like, you know, you're cheating on me, or I can't believe you're doing this, you know, I care about you, you don't value me. Like they'll turn it around like that and play victim. So also be very cautious of that. It can look very different than the really aggressive type.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what are some other ways that we can identify, like when we're in the early stages of dating, what are some things to just kind of look for or watch out for? Any other things that you think are important that we mention other than some of the things we've already talked about?
So I would be very cautious to look at the rest of their life. Sometimes narcissistic characters will have a lot of friends, but you realize like they're not close friends. They're more like acquaintances. They're people on the periphery. They don't have a close relationship with them. You want to look at things like that. You want to look for the triangulation. That's definitely going to come up. That's where they're comparing you to other people. That's where they're just talking about other people, but in a way that's meant to make you feel insecure, because they're talking about qualities that you have, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of thing. That is classic move. They might be comparing you with their exes. You know, my ex did this, and a very subtle way would be telling you about their ex and how they did this thing that wasn't okay for them. Like maybe it's a man that says his ex like never wanted to have sex with him, like she wasn't available, so you just got to feel so bad for him. He ended up, you know, being with these other women, you know, that kind of thing. Basically, he's grooming you. He's telling you how you need to behave in order for him to stay in your life. Be very careful of that. You also notice things like dog whistling. And this might be a little further down in the relationship, but it could happen earlier. Dog whistling comes from dog whistle politics, where a politician will say something that sounds like normal conversation to everyone, but to the people in the know, there's a specific code. They're understanding something at a different level. How that translates to a relationship is you're sitting with his friends or his family or your family, and he says something to the group, because dog whistling means there's an audience, right? But he says something to the group that's abusive to you, and no one else realizes it. And he'll provoke you to react. So if you react, you look like the crazy one. You look like the person who has the problem because no one else heard the abuse and what's going on. It's like some kind of inside joke, insider information, a conversation that you had, an experience you had with this person that no one else knows, and you're sitting there dying. And so be very careful of those provocations. They'll do that on a one-on-one basis, and then they'll use the group or the audience to do that as well. And then you end up looking like the bad person. And then it's really hard to explain to people what's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the key things that I think is really important, and I know you and I would agree on this because I know we've talked about some of this before, is what you might call slow dating. I love that term that you've formed here, Meredith. And I always say approach a new relationship from a place of curiosity and observation, which simply means you're really paying attention. You're going in with your eyes wide open. You're curious about how this person is showing up, and you're looking for those patterns over a period of time. And you're being observant. You're not pretending things are different than what the reality is, even if there's a lot of attraction or even if you really like them. You're observing. This is not to say that you're like out there like looking for something really bad, but you're paying attention. You're aware. Your eyes are open. You're not just being bamboozled by their charm or their or by the attraction or by your desire for a relationship. So say a little bit more from your point of view about the idea of slow dating, because I love this and I think it's such a powerful tool to help support women in this area. Yeah.
That's pretty much exactly it. So I call it slow love, like the slow food movement, you know, where you cook and you really take this time to prepare the meal. And I think that's really how we need to be approaching dating, is taking our time, is really getting to feel out a person, to observe their behavior. You know, what happens when you set a boundary? What happens when you say no? What happens when you don't meet their expectations? Do they give you the silent treatment? Do they start putting you down? Do they start comparing you with people? These kinds of things will inevitably show up with narcissistic characters. And the best thing you can give yourself is that time, because as they say, sooner or later, everyone paints themselves, right? Even the most covert form of abuser is eventually going to reveal themselves, because you're not being the easy prey. They are always looking for the easiest prey. Who is that? That's the person with no boundaries, with no self-worth, looking outside for approval and validation, people-pleasing, self-sacrificing. These kinds of characteristics, which we tend to call codependency, is the perfect match for a predator, for an abusive or manipulative person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another key to being immunizing ourselves from this sort of person, from these sort of patterns, is what I call being centered in your own value, which encompasses those things that you were talking about: having standards, having boundaries, being clear about who you are, not having your value be based on what is or isn't happening with another person from that outside feedback, those kinds of things. That's what I mean by being centered in your own value. You're making your decisions based on what is right for you, what feels right for you, not just to try to get approval or to get love from another person, because that makes us susceptible to these kind of characters if we're looking for that kind of reinforcement from them.
Exactly. Self-worth and self-trust are two of your best forms of immunity against people like this. Because if you value yourself, like you taught me when I was doing coaching with you, like you're never going to sacrifice your self-worth again for another relationship. As soon as that relationship is no longer matching your value and your worth, you're going to leave. When you have self-trust, you know, every time those little things come up that just don't feel right, that you can't really explain, you can't put your finger on, you don't really have proof, it doesn't matter. That feeling is proof enough. And it's funny because they're looking for someone who doesn't trust themselves. When I was dating this guy for less than like a month or so, I barely knew him, but he tried to do that gaslighting thing where he made me feel like I was crazy, that I wasn't perceiving what was happening. And he literally said to me, "You trust yourself too much." And I said,
oh, wow.
Like, he's done. He couldn't have been more obvious with what he said. So really look for that, ladies. Like, if you're with somebody who's trying to undermine your self-trust and you're saying, I feel this and this is what I perceive, and they're discounting that, that person is not safe for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here's another question I want to ask you. So coming back to this special that I told you about of people that had been hurt by people with these patterns in Australia. Of course, this happens all over the world. One of the things that struck me, besides the fact that they were talking about that anyone could be susceptible to this under the right set of circumstances, is one of the women, as I recall, toward the end, even though now she knew that she had been completely bamboozled, deceived, and harmed by this person, was still kind of saying, I'm still in love with him. I still am like caught up in the fantasy. And so I wanted to bring this up because in case there's anyone listening who might be in the middle of something like this right now, might be in the middle of something that's sounding like this, or some of this sounds familiar. What do we do? What do we do to break free? How do we break free? Because the other thing about this kind of thing is it can be like people can get so enmeshed in these kind of relationships that it can be really difficult to break free.
What you're describing is what we call cognitive dissonance and the trauma bond. So the trauma bond is like a higher octave of the cognitive dissonance. These are both caused by that intermittent reinforcement, the love bombing, the devaluation. That creates the strongest bond between people. It's the same thing that happens in the Stockholm syndrome, where the hostage will identify with the captor, they'll defend the captor, right? So you meet this person and you're still going back and forth afterward, but maybe they were a good person, but they did these good things for me, but then they're abusive, right? And that's what you're describing, is it's so hard to let go. So to break free from that cognitive dissonance, you have to relentlessly face the truth. So I recommend people write a list with bullet points of all the things that felt off, manipulative, abusive, hurtful that that person did from the very first moment you met. It's called the sobriety list because it sobers your mind up out of that trance. It is like a trance. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It's the primal part of the brain that bonds with the abuser out of survival. So it's not the cognitive brain. It's not the conscious brain. I have clients who are PhDs, right? It's not about intelligence. It latches in with the primal drive to survive, to be okay. So you have to relentlessly face that truth in order to break free. Every time your mind wants to indulge in the fantasy, the illusion, the toxic hope, the denial, you got to pick up that list and read it until you snap out of that. And so eventually that will break down. That cognitive dissonance will break free. But you'll know that you're still in it when you're going back and forth. He loves me not. He's a good person, he's an abuser. So that cycle, you really got to break free out of that, because that's the glue that keeps people going back. They've done studies, the average is 7 times that a person will go back to the abuser. That's
Wow.
Something I also didn't mention is called hoovering. So after you break out of that relationship, what's going to happen is you need to go completely no contact, blocking them on social media, phone, everything. You don't answer the door. You don't answer if they come to work. They're going to be hoovering. Hoovering is when they try to suck you back, like the Hoover vacuum, the brand. And that's what they're going to try to do. And it's going to be the same abuse cycle. At first, it's going to be very sweet and maybe even apologetic. If they're very covert, I'm so sorry, I need to get you back, I miss you, I love you, you're so amazing. But when you don't respond to that very quickly, it gets very mean, very cruel, very fast. And so it's like a more expedited version of that abusive cycle. So be very aware of that. If you've identified the abuser, you set the no contact boundary, be aware that they are going to try to come back. That's why you have to do that work to break down the cognitive dissonance, to keep your mind sober.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is probably why some of these women who are even in relationships where like there's actual physical abuse, you know, maybe these men beat them. I saw another YouTube special where these women had been through unbelievable physical abuse to the point, you know, where it was like they were on the brink of death. And they still, and then of course the pattern you're describing, the men were coming back, I'm so sorry, I have to get you back, it'll never happen again. And these women were considering it, and in some cases had gone back and then had received the abuse again. So this is actually really dangerous. This is actually really dangerous to stay in these relationships with these kind of people. Because, you know, there are cases of women even being killed by these kind of people when they don't get their way. They can be so controlling. Now, I realize that may be extreme, but at the very least, your self-esteem is going to take a beating, right?
Well,
You stay in it.
It's not actually that extreme, because you have to take into consideration the risk. Some people actually die at the hands of abusers. All the rest of the people have lost their health, their sanity, their peace, their success, their well-being. I mean, you name it, their self-worth, their self-esteem, their confidence, like everything good that you've worked, not to mention like your bank account and all that, everything that you've worked to build is at risk when you're in a relationship like this. And, you know, I really encourage people not to minimize the fact that, well, you know, he's not physically abusive, it's really not that bad. That doesn't matter. Sometimes people who've never physically abused end up killing their partners. You know, women are much more likely to die at the hands of a male partner who's abusive than men with female abusive partners. So be very careful, because like I said, at the very least, you are putting at risk your health, your sanity, your well-being. And by health, I mean serious, chronic, long-term health conditions. The longer people stay in those relationships, the worse their health is, because these people are like energy vampires. They will suck the life force energy out of you. And you'll go to your doctor with pains and problems, and your doctor will have a hard time identifying the organic cause of all that, because it's not a physical cause. It's too much psychological stress that needs an outlet. So it goes to your body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate your emphasis on that, because yeah, you're right. Those other things are so incredibly important and so incredibly valuable. And yes, not to minimize if there's not an actual physically abusive situation going on, there are still incredible risks involved in staying in relationships with these people. So I want to swing back to something you said a little earlier, just again, because I want to put a little bit more emphasis on this. And that is, you said, don't date when you're lonely, because you're in that vulnerable state. And it made me think back, Meredith, to a situation in my own life where I did get involved with someone in a very unhealthy relationship, because he was, I don't know what the actual diagnosis was, but he was a very dangerous man. And, you know, I didn't know at the time that I met him, but he had a rap sheet a mile long and was incredibly, incredibly abusive. But that didn't happen until after the initial charming, charismatic, flattering kind of behavior showed up. And I had a hard time breaking free from that relationship, and was very much at risk at the hands of this man, you know, physically, financially, all kinds of ways. And when I look back on that now, you know, I'm a relationship coach now, and I help other women in relationships. When I look back on that, I think, how did that happen? Because this person was so out of sync with the kind of people that I normally dated. He's totally the opposite kind of person than my husband. And I'm like, how did that happen? Well, the way it happened was because I was in a really vulnerable state. A relationship that I had really hoped would work out and had a lot invested in ended, totally devastated me, broke my heart. And in my mind, I thought the way to get over that was to hurry and get back into another relationship without giving myself a chance and the space to do some healing. And so I rebounded into this very unhealthy relationship. I mean, literally just like that. And I don't think I would have been vulnerable to that, or that I would have ever gotten involved with that person had I given myself that chance to heal and to take some time for me during this period of feeling lonely and brokenhearted before re-engaging in dating again. So I just wanted to put like the accent point on that, because I think that can really be a protective thing for women out there if they're kind of going through a transition post-divorce or post-relationship or breakup.
For sure. Especially if it was a bad situation, really painful, or it was with another narcissistic kind of character. I recommend people take a minimum of 6 months, if not a year, off the dating market. 6 months meaning you had a few months of a relationship, maybe maximum it was 6 months long. But if you're with that person for years, maybe in the case of some people, they were married for decades, you might need 2-3 years of being on your own and rebuilding yourself again, because the longer you're in that kind of situation, the more vulnerable you are. And that's really where the radical self-care comes in. That's where you got to turn to that and focus on rebuilding yourself and taking care of yourself. And when you feel good, when you feel strong and you're no longer lonely, then you can start getting out into the dating market again. But really, really be cautious. Don't date when you're lonely. Like you said, some people give you that bad advice, like, oh, just, go meet somebody else and you'll get over the last one. And that is just the worst kind of advice, especially if you're coming off of an abusive relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so important to allow for that space and that time for healing, because then you're attracting someone more from a place of sharing and abundance rather than this place of feeling like needy, like I've got to have someone to feel this emptiness in my heart. If you're coming from that place of feeling like, I've got to have someone to fill this hole in my heart that was left by this other person, or to help me to numb this pain, so to speak, that makes us really vulnerable. Yeah. It's really, really vulnerable. So
they say like, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, they say you attract who you are. And I don't really like that phrase, because I think it's more of a yin and a yang. You attract the flip side. So if you date when you're lonely, you're going to meet someone who makes you feel more lonely than you already feel. If you don't have boundaries, you're going to meet someone who abuses boundaries. So it's like the flip side of that. If you have lost your self-worth, you're going to meet somebody who doesn't value you. So if you take that time to rebuild your self-worth, you're going to be at a level where you can attract somebody who sees your worth, who values your worth. And I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it comes back to this idea, you need to value your own worth first. Right. Because I believe that we can't receive that from someone else if we don't have it from within. In other words, if we don't approve of our own selves, love our own selves, we can't receive more than what we're already offering for ourselves. Exactly. So this is really, really important. I want to ask you, Meredith, I know you have this incredible YouTube channel where you've done all of these videos and go into a lot of different areas of exploring all of this. Besides that, and first tell us how to find that and what some of the resources are there, but also on top of that, tell us any other resources, books, or anything like that that you might recommend for women who are listening to this, and some of this is resonating. What are some gateways for deeper help on this front?
So my YouTube channel is called Inner Integration, and I do videos in English and in Spanish. So find loads of content there. I also have a podcast. It's the Inner Integration Podcast. And then on my website, I offer a lot of digital courses to help people rebuild, to help people self-heal after these relationships. I also have a book called The Journey, a roadmap to self-healing after narcissistic abuse. And if people go to my website, say they're just figuring this out, like, oh, wow, I was with a narcissist and get out of this. I'm still dealing with all these after effects. On my website, you can get a free quick start guide. It's like an ebook you can get instant download to help you, like the first 3 steps to get going on your recovery process after narcissistic abuse.
And is your website innerintegration.com?
Correct.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. because I want people to know where they can go to get additional support specifically in this area if that's something that's going on for them. I think it's so important. So anything you wish I would have asked you or anything else you want to add before we wrap up today, Meredith?
Nothing immediately coming to mind. I just really encourage people to focus on self-worth and self-trust. That's a big thing that I worked on with you, was rebuilding that. Those are your main sources of immunity against predators, against manipulators and abusers. Because when you trust yourself, when you value yourself, you're not going to sacrifice everything good that you've worked hard to build in your life for someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why a huge foundational piece of the work that I do is helping women to be centered in their own value. I always say, you're a woman of high value, be a woman of high value, navigate the world as a woman of high value, make your decisions about dating, men, love, relationships from knowing your own value. Because when you do that, you're much less likely to be sucked into these kind of relationships that have these unhealthy behaviors and patterns from some of these men. And this is not to scare people, because there are good people out there. But like I said at the beginning of our conversation, one of the keys to being with the right man is not being tangled up with the wrong man.
Exactly.
And so recognizing, because you can invest years, months, years of your life into a relationship with the wrong man if you don't recognize some of these patterns and behaviors. So our intention here is to give you some tools and some insights to help you avoid that, so that your path to the right man can be shorter, shorter and sweeter, and you don't have to go through these experiences of abuse. So Meredith, I really want to thank you, because I think this has really been a fantastic conversation, and I think you've given us some real important tips, ideas, concepts that are going to be so valuable. So I'm really appreciative to have this opportunity to highlight your wisdom and for your generosity and sharing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And ladies, be sure to check out the resources that Meredith has mentioned. We'll also have some links underneath this audio and video that you're listening or watching from. I'll also see if I can find that link to the Australian special that I referenced a couple of times here too as well. So we're so grateful for your presence here, and hope that you found this valuable, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye for now.